Blood. That's the first thing he claimed to see when he opened his eyes. A dark red stain smeared across her pillow, dripping from her nose. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. The room was silent except for his panicked breaths. Only hours earlier, she had been alive, laughing, vibrant, carefully picking out an outfit for a date that was supposed to be exciting, maybe even the start of something new. Now, at 6:30 a.m., on December 12, 2021, 23-year-old Lauren Smith Fields lay lifeless in her own bed beside a man she had just met. What happened in those missing hours between hope and horror? How does a young woman, healthy, athletic, with her whole life ahead of her, vanish into silence overnight? To answer that, we have to go back before the blood, before the unanswered phone calls, before the headlines. Back to the beginning of Lauren's story. Lauren was born on the 23rd of January 1998 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. From the start, she carried herself with a spirit that drew people in. She grew up in a home filled with love. Her parents, Chantel Fields and Everett Smith, encouraged her to believe she could accomplish anything she dreamed. At Stamford High School, she proved them right. On the track, she was relentless, a sprinter whose determination pushed her through exhaustion, whose discipline inspired coaches and teammates alike. But she wasn't just an athlete. Off the track, Lauren radiated warmth. Friends described her as someone who could turn an ordinary evening into an adventure. She loved fashion, mixing bold colors and styles to show the world exactly who she was. Confident, unapologetic, unique. Her Instagram wasn't curated for likes. It was a diary of joy, color, and life. She had wanderlust too. Her photos carried her across oceans, Jamaica, Italy, England. Each trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a chance to experience the world with wide eyes and an open heart. She wanted to collect memories, not possessions. By 2021, Lauren was enrolled at Norwalk Community College, studying physical therapy. She wanted to heal others, to help people regain strength the way she had built her own. Professors remembered her curiosity, her hunger to learn, her kindness toward classmates. She was building a life full of promise, and then there was her bond with her mother. Chantel and Lauren weren't just mother and daughter, they were friends, confidantes. They could talk for hours about anything, or nothing at all. Chantel often said she wasn't just proud of Lauren, she was inspired by her. There was one more important truth about Lauren. She was disciplined with her health. Years of running track had taught her to care for her body. She exercised, ate clean, and avoided substances. Everyone who knew her, friends, family, professors, would tell you the same thing. Lauren didn't do drugs. She treated her body like a temple. That detail would later become devastatingly important. By late 2021, like many young women her age, Lauren was dipping her toes into the uncertain waters of online dating. Millions swipe each day, searching for something real. For Lauren, that app was Bumble, the one where women make the first move. It gave her control, a sense of safety. Her profile reflected her spirit. Adventurous, stylish, vibrant. That's how she connected with him, Matthew LaFountain, a 37-year-old white man from Milford, Connecticut. He was 14 years older than Lauren, closer to her parents' age than her own, but she believed in connection, not just numbers. Their conversations seemed harmless at first. He asked about her studies, her family, her goals. For 3 days, they exchanged messages that built a fragile bridge of trust. On Sunday, December 11th, Lauren prepared for their first in-person meeting. She texted her friends with excitement. She chose her outfit with care. She tidied her Plymouth Street apartment, stocked up on food and drinks. She was cautious, but hopeful. For her, it was just a date. For him, perhaps something more. When he arrived that evening, the sun was setting over Bridgeport. Lauren greeted him with the smile everyone knew, warm, bright, inviting. They ordered food, shared drinks, laughed over small games. To Matthew, it may have felt like any ordinary night. To Lauren, it was a step of faith, opening her door to someone new. She even took a call from her brother mid-evening, stepping outside to chat. Her voice was upbeat, her mood unchanged. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as the night wore on, something shifted. According to Matthew, Lauren disappeared into the bathroom for about 15 minutes. He claimed she was vomiting, that maybe the tequila had been too much. But those who knew her knew she was careful, never reckless, always aware of her limits. When she came out, she seemed exhausted, unwell. He said she lay down on the couch, drifting into a sudden, heavy sleep. Too sudden. Too deep. He carried her to bed. He told police he lay beside her. He insisted nothing sexual happened, but in the bathroom, investigators later discovered a used condom containing semen. His story and the evidence didn't match. At 6:30 a.m., Matthew said he woke to find her nose bleeding, her body motionless. He dialed 911, claimed he tried chest compressions, claimed he panicked, but by then, Lauren was already gone. A young woman with dreams of traveling, healing, building a future, was dead. And the question still burns. How does a healthy, disciplined, 23-year-old woman end up dead after one night with a stranger? On the morning of December 12th, while paramedics rushed into Lauren's apartment and police casually questioned the man who had spent the night with her, her mother was at home with her phone in her hand. Chantel Fields texted her daughter, the way she did every day. No reply. She called. Straight to voicemail. For a mother who knew her daughter's rhythms when she worked out, when she studied, when she answered texts, silence wasn't just unusual. It was terrifying. By evening, that silence had hardened into dread. Lauren's brother tried calling. Friends sent messages. Nothing. Every unanswered call felt like a scream into the void. Chantel tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe Lauren's phone had died. Maybe she was out with friends. But deep down, she knew. A mother always knows. What she didn't know, what none of her family knew, was that by the time she first dialed Lauren's number that morning, her daughter had already been gone for hours. Lauren's body had been lying lifeless in her bed since dawn. Her final moments witnessed only by a stranger. And the most unthinkable part? No one from law enforcement thought to tell them. It wasn't until December 13th, nearly 2 days later, that Chantel and her son decided they couldn't wait anymore. They drove to Lauren's apartment, praying she would open the door, sheepish and apologetic, saying her phone had died. But instead, taped to the door, they found a note. Not an official police document, not even a message from paramedics, just a scrap of paper from the landlord. If you're looking for Lauren, call this number. Imagine that. Learning your child is gone, not from officers trained to deliver devastating news with compassion, but from a landlord's note taped to a door. And when Chantel dialed the number, the voice on the other end was not gentle, not empathetic. It was matter-of-fact, clinical, as if Lauren's death was just another item on a long list. When she finally connected with the lead detective, she expected guidance, answers, maybe even some shred of humanity. Instead, she met indifference. His tone was cold, dismissive, almost annoyed at her questions. When she pressed about Matthew LaFountain, the last man to see her daughter alive, his response was staggering. He seemed like a nice guy. As if nice guys couldn't lie. As if nice guys couldn't harm. As if a woman's death beside a stranger didn't warrant more than a shrug. The arrogance was unbearable. Lauren's father later described the detective as condescending, uninterested in even the most basic duties. Chantel's grief poured out. "It's killing me inside. I miss my baby. No one is going to discard my daughter like she's rubbish." And that's exactly how it felt. Like because Lauren was young. Because she was a black woman. Because the man she was with was white and polite and middle-aged. Her death was already being swept aside, written off before an investigation had even begun. Days passed. Evidence that should have been collected immediately was left untouched. Detectives told the family they'd return to gather more items. They never showed. So the family took matters into their own hands. On December 29th, 17 days after Lauren's death, they unlocked her apartment. What they found should have been preserved as evidence, but instead it was waiting for them like ghosts. The used condom Matthew had denied. A pill on the counter. Bloody sheets still stained with her final breaths. Half-finished drinks on the table. Lubricant bottles that contradicted Matthew's claims that nothing sexual had occurred. 17 days had passed. 17 days of contamination, of degradation, of crucial clues lost forever. Evidence that could have spoken for Lauren had been left to rot. Later, when a new detective eventually took over the case, his first words to the family were an admission. "I messed up. I didn't know what I was doing. I messed up the case." But by then, what did that mean? The damage was already done. By January 2022, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner released its report. The cause of death: acute intoxication from the combined effects of fentanyl, promethazine, hydroxyzine, and alcohol. The manner of death: accident. An accident. Her family was stunned. To them, this wasn't just inaccurate. It was insulting. Lauren didn't do drugs. She wasn't reckless. She had trained her body like an athlete, guarded her health like it was sacred. To believe she willingly ingested fentanyl, a drug 50 times stronger than heroin, lethal in specks the size of salt, was to believe she was someone she wasn't. Fentanyl doesn't just appear in your body. Someone puts it there. So who did? Why didn't police test the drinks left in her apartment? Why didn't they ask Matthew if he had access to those substances? Why was there no timeline of when those drugs entered her system? The medical examiner's report felt like a door slamming shut. Accident. Case closed. But Chantel refused to accept it. She paid thousands of dollars for an independent autopsy. "Without a doubt, we know my daughter was not a drug user," she told reporters. And while she sought the truth, Matthew LaFountain, the last man with her, vanished. He deleted his social media. His dating profiles disappeared. Police never subpoenaed his phone, never checked his devices, never interviewed women he had dated before. They let him walk away, unquestioned, untouched, unexamined. The silence was deafening. The cracks in the system had become canyons. It was then, in those long weeks of grief and unanswered questions, that Lauren's friends turned to the one tool they knew could cut through silence: social media. At first, the videos were small clips of Lauren's smile, shaky voices demanding answers, hashtags like number justice for Lauren Smithfields. Then strangers joined in. Young women across Connecticut shared their own stories of dating app dangers, of police dismissing their pleas, of their fear of being forgotten if something ever happened to them. The videos spread. They grew louder. And then, one voice with millions of followers shouted what Lauren's family had been saying all along. Cardi B tweeted, "Connecticut, You have failed that young lady. Those 12 words changed everything. Suddenly, the story that Bridgeport police had tried to dismiss was national news. Suddenly, everyone was asking, why was Lauren's death treated as an afterthought? Why was her family told by a landlord's note? Why wasn't the only witness treated as a suspect? The contrast to other cases was impossible to ignore. Just months earlier, Gabby Petito's disappearance had dominated every headline, every broadcast. Helicopters, drones, federal agents scoured the wilderness for her. Entire specials were dedicated to her story. But Lauren? A young black woman, dead under suspicious circumstances, evidence left to rot, her family ignored. No wall-to-wall coverage, no national outcry until social media forced it, and with the spotlight came the most haunting realization of all. When certain women die, the system fights for answers. When others do, it doesn't. Would you have accepted the ruling of accident? Or, like Chantel, would you believe something far darker lurked beneath the surface? Lauren's family had shouted into every silence, phone calls, press inquiries, desperate pleas for the police to take her death seriously. And for weeks, it felt like no one was listening. The medical examiner had stamped accident on her death certificate. The lead detective had brushed them off. The man who spent her final hours with her had walked away free. So her friends did what millions of young people know how to do best. They turned to TikTok. At first, the posts were small and intimate. Clips of Lauren's bright smile. Friends speaking into their phones. Voices shaking with grief. Hashtags. Number Justice for Lauren Smithfields. Number Say Her Name. One by one, young women across Connecticut began sharing their own stories about dangerous dating encounters, about police dismissing their fears, about what it feels like to wonder if your death would even matter to the system. The videos spread faster than anyone expected. Each clip was raw, emotional, impossible to scroll past. Soon, Lauren's face was everywhere, and then Cardi B saw it. With a single tweet, just 12 words, she did what the Bridgeport Police Department refused to do. She made the world look. Connecticut, you have failed that young lady. The effect was electric. Overnight, Lauren's name went from whispered grief in Bridgeport to national outrage. Headlines screamed. Television anchors repeated the same question Lauren's family had been begging for weeks. Why was her death treated as an afterthought? The timing made the contrast even sharper. Just a few months earlier, Gabby Petito's disappearance had captured the country. Entire cable networks dedicated nightly specials to her case. Federal agents searched mountains, rivers, and forests. Every update was broadcast to millions. But Lauren, a 23-year-old black woman, found dead in her own apartment, with drugs in her system that her family swore she never touched, and a man twice her age who deleted his online presence hours later. Her story had barely made local news until social media forced it. Advocates called it what it was: missing white woman syndrome. The pattern where cases involving young white women received obsessive coverage while cases involving women of color were ignored, dismissed, or buried. Gabby Petito had been a household name. Lauren was nearly forgotten until TikTok and Twitter refused to let her vanish. The pressure on Bridgeport authorities grew unbearable. Social media users uncovered inconsistencies in Matthew LaFountain's story. They noticed how quickly his dating profiles disappeared after her death. They pointed out contradictions between his statements and the physical evidence. Questions police should have been asking from day one were now being shouted by millions online. Why wasn't Matthew treated as a suspect? Why weren't his devices seized? Why weren't his phone records pulled? Why wasn't the condom tested immediately? Why did investigators leave a potential crime scene unsecured for weeks? The outrage boiled over on the 23rd of January 2022, what would have been Lauren's 24th birthday. Hundreds of people filled the streets of Bridgeport in protest. They carried signs with her name. They wore purple, her favorite color. They chanted for justice, demanding answers. At the front stood her mother, Chantel. Her voice was cracked but steady as she shouted into the crowd. They wanted us to forget about our daughter, our sister, our loved one. They thought they were going to throw her away like she was garbage, but we won't let them. The march ended at the police station. Protesters taped posters of Lauren's smile to the walls. They tied ribbons to the fences. They demanded accountability from the very system that had dismissed her. And slowly, the spotlight forced movement. Bridgeport suspended 2 detectives involved in the case, citing mishandling. For a brief moment, it seemed like progress, but within weeks, both were quietly reinstated. No real punishment, no answers, just business as usual. Lauren's family knew they needed more than public outrage. They needed legal firepower. Enter Darnell Crosland, a civil rights attorney known for taking on cases where systemic bias was impossible to ignore. When he looked at Lauren's case, he didn't just see negligence, he saw violations of her family's constitutional rights. On their behalf, he filed a $30 million lawsuit against the city of Bridgeport. But this wasn't about money. It was about exposing the failures in black and white. The lawsuit detailed every misstep. Police failed to notify her family for 2 days. They left her apartment unsecured, allowing evidence to degrade. They dismissed the only witness instead of interrogating him. They showed bias not just in their negligence but in their attitude, minimizing the life of a young black woman because she didn't fit the profile of a worthy victim. The filing also struck at the heart of the issue. If Lauren had been white, if she had been from a wealthier neighborhood, the investigation would have been entirely different. Detectives would have secured the scene. Media would have flooded in. Resources would have been poured into the case. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was glaring. And yet, even as the lawsuit made its way into the courts, the family still had no answers. Matthew LaFountain remained free, untouched, his name shielded. He hadn't been charged. He hadn't been interrogated beyond a few questions. He hadn't offered condolences, hadn't spoken publicly, hadn't reached out to Lauren's grieving family. He had simply disappeared, erasing his digital footprint, fading into silence. For Chantel and her family, that silence was louder than words, because anyone who truly cared about Lauren would have spoken, would have fought to clear their name, would have shown some measure of humanity. But Matthew said nothing, and the police let him. That silence, that indifference, cut deeper than any report. It told the family everything they needed to know. They were on their own. So they kept fighting. In the state legislature, lawmakers introduced Lauren's Law, requiring police to notify families within 24 hours when a loved one dies. No more taped notes from landlords. No more mothers waiting by the phone for calls that never come. It was a small step, carved out of unimaginable pain, but beneath the progress, the haunting questions remained unanswered. Who gave Lauren the fentanyl that killed her? Why was her apartment left unsecured? Why did the police protect him instead of protecting her? The truth was still out there, waiting. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear. The system wasn't going to give it willingly, and that left Lauren's family with only one choice: keep fighting until someone listened. The protests in Bridgeport had made something clear. Lauren's death was not just a private tragedy. It had become a public reckoning. Her mother, her family, her friends had turned their grief into a rallying cry. And as the crowds grew louder, lawmakers could no longer look away. In early 2022, the Connecticut state legislature introduced a bill that would bear Lauren's name. Lauren's Law. The proposal was simple, but powerful. It required police to notify families within 24 hours when a loved one died, and to do so with proper documentation and compassion. It was shocking that such a law even had to exist, but Lauren's case had proved the unimaginable. Without it, families could be left to learn the worst news of their lives from a scrap of paper taped to a door. When Chantel spoke before lawmakers, her voice shook but never wavered. "I found out my daughter was dead from a landlord's note," she said. "No mother, no family, should ever experience that." Her words rippled through the chamber, cutting past politics, past procedure, striking at something deeply human. The bill passed quickly, with overwhelming support, and for a brief moment, Lauren's family felt a measure of victory. Her name was now etched into state law, written in ink and grief. Other families would be spared the cruelty they had endured, but the law was only one piece of the fight. The larger questions remained. Why had the police treated Lauren's case with such indifference? Why had they dismissed the only witness? Why had they failed to collect evidence, failed to test the drinks, failed to treat her death with urgency? The family's attorney, Darnell Crosland, wasn't finished. He pressed forward with the civil rights lawsuit against Bridgeport, determined to force the failures into public record. He demanded the release of the 911 calls, the police reports, the full toxicology findings. Every request met resistance: delays, redactions, denials. The wall of silence stayed intact, but public opinion had shifted. Across the nation, Lauren's story was now a symbol of systemic bias. Commentators pointed to her case alongside others, exposing a pattern of neglect when Black women were victims. Advocates used the phrase "missing white woman syndrome," not as an abstract idea, but as a mirror, holding up the difference in how America valued lives. The comparison was brutal. When Gabby Petito vanished, federal agents, helicopters, and national news outlets mobilized for weeks. When Lauren was found dead in her apartment, her family was ignored for days, evidence left to rot, her death stamped an accident within weeks. The contrast was not subtle, it was glaring. And it forced the country to confront an uncomfortable truth: whose lives are deemed worthy of pursuit, and whose are quietly filed away. For Chantel, there was no comfort in the attention. Every headline, every protest, every hearing brought back the same unbearable reality. Lauren was gone. The victory of Lauren's Law was hollow in its triumph. "We're grateful her name lives on," Chantel said, "but I'd give up every law, every headline, just to hear her voice again." Still, she fought on. She transformed her grief into activism, mentoring other mothers who had lost daughters under suspicious circumstances. She spoke at rallies, on television, in courtrooms, carrying her daughter's face like a banner. Every time she opened her mouth, she made sure Lauren was not forgotten. And yet, despite all the noise, one man remained silent. The man who spent her last hours with her, Matthew LaFountain. He had vanished from social media, vanished from dating apps, vanished from public life. He had not been charged, not been forced to testify, not even been seriously questioned. He had not once reached out to Lauren's family. He had not spoken publicly about that night. He had simply disappeared. For her family, his silence was louder than any confession. If he had nothing to hide, why not speak? If he cared about truth, why not explain? Why delete his profiles? Why vanish from sight? And why, most of all, Did the police let him walk away untouched? The questions piled up, each one more suffocating than the last. Who put fentanyl into Lauren's body? Why was there a condom in her apartment if nothing happened? Why was there a pill on the floor, bloody sheets on her bed, drinks still unfinished? Why were those items not tested? Why did officers decide, within hours, that her death was simply an accident? The silence from authorities was deafening. And so the family kept pushing, kept demanding, kept screaming her name so loudly that the nation could not look away. By mid-2022, Lauren's case had become a case study in systemic failure. Civil rights groups cited it in reports. Law schools dissected it in classrooms. Journalists used it as evidence of bias in policing and media. And for families across America, it became a warning. If this could happen to Lauren, a healthy, educated, beloved young woman with a family fighting for her, what hope was there for women whose stories never made the news at all? For Chantel, that question was unbearable. But it was also her fuel. They thought they could erase her, she said. They thought they could write her off as an accident. But as long as I have breath in my body, they will not erase my daughter. Her voice had become a weapon. And her daughter's name, once dismissed, now carried the weight of a movement. Still, beneath the activism, beneath the laws and lawsuits, the haunting truth remained. Lauren's killer had never been found. The man who was with her had never been held accountable. The answers were still locked away in silence, and until that silence broke, justice would remain out of reach. The courthouse was supposed to be where truth lived. For Lauren's family, it became a place where silence loomed larger than words. By mid-2022, their lawsuit against the city of Bridgeport was moving forward. $30 million in damages wasn't the goal, it was a weapon, a way to force the failures of the police department into the light, to etch them into public record so they could never be denied. Attorney Darnell Crosland laid the failures out like exhibits. The 2-day delay in notifying Lauren's family, the unsecured apartment left open for contamination, the used condom, the bloody sheets, the pill evidence left to rot, the failure to question the only witness, the dismissive words of a detective who called him a nice guy. Each failure wasn't just negligence, it was betrayal. The city's reaction was predictable. Denials, delays, redactions. For every request, the family made 911 calls, toxicology breakdowns, full police reports. Officials responded with silence, or worse, with thick black bars across pages that should have contained answers. For Chantel, every delay was a wound. Every redacted page felt like another attempt to bury her daughter a second time. But she refused to give in. Silence is what they're counting on, she told reporters, and silence is the one thing we will never give them. Meanwhile, the public trial had already begun, the trial of opinion. On social media, in living rooms, on news broadcasts, the questions kept multiplying. Why was Matthew LaFountain never investigated properly? Why did his dating profiles vanish the same day Lauren died? Why did the police protect him instead of pressing him for answers? Matthew himself remained a ghost. He had deleted his accounts, vanished from public view, refused to speak. No apologies. No explanations. No humanity. The man who spent Lauren's last hours with her was free, rebuilding his life in silence, while Chantel's life was shattered beyond repair. His silence, to many, was its own confession, not of guilt, but of indifference, of the privilege to walk away untouched, while others carried the unbearable weight of loss. Still, Lauren's story was growing beyond Bridgeport. Her name was spoken in protests from New York to Los Angeles. Advocates cited her case when pushing for reforms nationwide. Civil rights attorneys invoked her story in lawsuits against police departments that had dismissed black families in the same cold, callous ways. In Connecticut, Lauren's law passed. Police were now required to notify families within 24 hours when a loved one died. Departments rolled out new protocols, new training sessions, new promises. Officers sat through seminars on cultural sensitivity, on compassion, on communication. On paper, the system was changing, but Chantel wasn't fooled. She knew how thin paper could be. Laws could be written, binders could be filled, but if the culture inside departments didn't change, if officers still saw some victims as less worthy of urgency, less deserving of dignity, then nothing truly had. They gave us a law, she said, but what we needed was justice, and justice still hadn't come. The autopsy results remained unchanged. Accident. The man in her apartment remained free. The evidence that could have revealed the truth had been compromised beyond repair. So Chantel shifted her fight. She turned grief into activism, becoming a mentor for other mothers who had lost daughters in suspicious, ignored circumstances. She stood beside them at rallies, coached them before press conferences, taught them how to turn silence into a weapon. Her daughter's story became a blueprint for resistance. Everywhere she went, she carried Lauren's face, a smile frozen in time, a reminder of what had been stolen. And slowly, Lauren's name began to transcend her tragedy. College professors cited her case in lectures about systemic bias. Journalists used her story as proof of missing white woman syndrome. Civil rights groups included her in reports about racial disparities in policing, in classrooms, dorm rooms, and living rooms. Lauren became a cautionary tale, a rallying cry, a name whispered as both warning and prayer. But for her family, the legacy was bittersweet. Every time her name was spoken, it was followed by the same unanswered questions. Who gave Lauren the fentanyl that killed her? Why were her final hours dismissed as an accident? Why did the man who was with her vanish into silence? Why did the police protect him instead of protecting her? The silence was unbearable. And yet, the fight kept her alive. Chantel often said her daughter had dreamed of healing bodies as a physical therapist. Instead, in death, she was forcing a system to heal, or at least to confront its wounds. Lauren had become more than a victim. She was a symbol of resistance, of truth demanded, of silence refused. But symbols don't answer questions. Movements don't fill the empty seat at a dinner table. Laws don't bring back laughter. For Chantel, every protest, every interview, every rally ended the same way, with the crushing weight of a reality she couldn't escape. Her daughter was gone, and the man who knew what happened that night still hadn't been forced to answer. The fight for Lauren's truth wasn't over. In some ways, it had only begun. And as the family pushed forward, one chilling fact became clearer with time. The answers they sought might never come from the system at all. There's still one more chapter to this story: the enduring legacy of Lauren's case, the national impact, and the haunting truth that justice never came for her. If you believe her story must be told until the end, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. Nearly 4 years have passed since that December morning when 23-year-old Lauren Smith Fields was found lifeless in her Bridgeport apartment. 4 years since her mother, Chantel, drove to her daughter's home, praying for answers, only to find a landlord's note taped to the door. 4 years since her family's grief hardened into outrage, and outrage became a movement. And still no charges, no arrest, no courtroom testimony. The case remains officially open. But in reality, it feels suspended in silence, left to gather dust. The man who was the last to see Lauren alive, Matthew LaFountain, has never stood before a judge, never been subjected to a polygraph, never had his phone records seized. He has simply vanished, living quietly, while Lauren's face lives on in hashtags, headlines, and heartbreak. For Chantel, silence has never been an option. She transformed her grief into fire, wielding her daughter's name like both shield and spear. She has become the mother who refuses to let the system bury her child twice, once in the ground and once in memory. Silence is what they're counting on. And silence is the one thing we will never give them. Her fight bore fruit. Lauren's law, passed in 2022, now requires Connecticut police to notify families within 24 hours when a loved one dies. A safeguard written in pain and ink. No other mother in the state will ever have to learn of her child's death from a taped note on a door. But laws are only paper. They cannot restore what was taken. They cannot bring back Lauren's laughter, her energy, her future. And that is the cruel truth that lingers. Justice never came. The haunting questions remain unanswered. Who gave Lauren the fentanyl? Fentanyl is not casual. It is not recreational. It is lethal in specks smaller than grains of sugar. It doesn't just appear in your body. Someone put it there. Combined with promethazine, hydroxyzine, and alcohol, it created a cocktail designed not for fun, but for incapacitation. Why was Matthew so insistent that no sexual activity occurred when evidence in the bathroom said otherwise? Why did he time her vomiting so precisely, 10 to 15 minutes, as if rehearsed? Why did he delete his profiles within hours of her death? And why, above all, did police never demand answers from him? Why did they protect him instead of protecting her? Each of these questions is an open wound, and wounds that never close become scars etched into the memory of a nation. Lauren's story has become more than tragedy. It is a mirror, forcing America to look at itself, to ask why some lives ignite headlines, while others fade into silence, to ask why some families are met with helicopters and agents, while others are met with scraps of paper and cold indifference, to ask what it means when justice itself seems rationed, granted to some, withheld from others. Her name echoes in classrooms, protests, courtrooms, and living rooms. Students debate her case in law schools. Activists chant it in marches. Mothers whisper it to daughters before first dates. Be careful. Remember Lauren. Her story is now bound to others, linked to the larger conversation about missing white woman syndrome. When Gabby Petito vanished, the world searched. When Lauren was found dead, the world had to be forced to care. That difference is not just chance, it is systemic. It is about race, class, and who society deems worthy of urgency. And yet, despite all the marches, all the reforms, all the headlines, the man who could answer the questions about Lauren's last hours walks free. He has never faced real scrutiny. He has never been held accountable. He has remained silent. That silence is deafening. It forces us to ask, what is justice, really? Is it a law passed after the fact? A suspension that ends in reinstatement? A lawsuit that drags on for years? Or is it the truth Lauren's family still doesn't have, the truth her case still withholds? Lauren's legacy is undeniable. She has changed laws. She has sparked national conversations. She has forced police departments to confront their failures. She has united strangers in grief and outrage. But her death is also a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how easily lives can be dismissed, how quickly silence can bury the truth if families don't fight back. And that is the most haunting truth of all. If this could happen to Lauren, a healthy, educated, loved young woman with a mother who refused to stay quiet, what happens to the women whose families don't have the spotlight, Whose cases never go viral? Whose names never trend on Twitter? How many Laurens are there, lost in silence, never given the dignity of answers? For Chantel, that thought is unbearable. But it is also why she keeps fighting. She carries her daughter's memory not as a wound, but as a torch. She lights the way for other families stumbling in the dark, reminding them that their voices matter, that their daughters matter. Because if Lauren's story teaches us anything, it is this: justice is not something given, it is something fought for. Her final legacy is not the unanswered questions, or even the reforms her death inspired. Her legacy is the reminder that silence kills, and that refusing silence is its own form of justice. But still, the silence lingers. As of today, Lauren's case remains unsolved. The official ruling of accident remains unchanged. The man who spent her last hours with her remains free, and the truth about what happened in that Bridgeport apartment remains locked away, buried in unanswered questions. And so, we end where we began. With silence. Not the silence of Lauren's laughter gone, not the silence of her voice erased, but the silence of a system that still hasn't told her family the truth. If it were your daughter, your sister, your loved one, would you accept that silence? Or would you, like Chantel, fight until your last breath to break it? Lauren's family never gave up, and maybe that is her truest legacy. To remind us all that justice is never handed down, it is demanded, fought for, screamed into the void until someone, somewhere, is finally forced to listen. There are still unanswered questions about Lauren's death, questions that could change everything if answered. If you believe her story deserves truth, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.